About 5:30 this evening, right at this location, 46th Street east of 3rd Avenue. Two people were shot numerous times. The only thing we can ascertain at this time is that it was three males wearing trench coats who left towards 2nd Avenue, and another witness states that he saw them get into a dark car. The tentative identification is that it's Paul Castellano and Tom Bellotti. As you're well aware, they're both on trial, or excuse me, I'm sure Castellano is on trial. I'm not that certain about Bellotti. They were shot numerous times with automatic weapons.
Caliber?
Where were they hit?
They were hit in the head and in the body.
Can you describe how it took place? Were they getting out of the car?
From the position, it looks as though they were getting out rather than getting in.
Was it close range?
Yes.
Were they dining at the Sparks restaurant?
Not to our knowledge.
You look at the reservation book there.
They wouldn't show it to us. No, that's not so. We don't know if they were in there or not, and it's kind of early yet to determine where they were, or where they were coming from, or where they were going to.
Were they hit from the front or the back?
It appears to be from the side and in the back.
Are there any eyewitnesses?
Well, we haven't come up with anybody that is volunteering anything at this point, but we will get some information, I'm sure, before the evening's over.
Chief, what would be the significance of a hit on Castellano in terms of the mob in this town?
Well, I'm not an organized crime expert. Maybe tomorrow you can get some experts to speculate. I don't know, and I don't care to speculate.
Do you think it damages the federal government's case against the Gambino crime family in Brooklyn?
Well, I don't think they have to prove guilt or innocence with him anymore. That case is over.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Do you have descriptions of the three men?
Not yet. Well, we will. We'll have some.
What's the guy's name? Were they white?
Bellotti.
Tom Bellotti.
Billotti.
Was he a driver or their friends?
Thank you.
New York police and the FBI were still trying to figure out why Paul Castellano, reputed chief of the Gambino family and alleged top mob godfather in the whole country, was gunned down on a Manhattan street Monday night. Last night, police parked a van outside the restaurant where it happened and tried to encourage any witnesses to come forward. The main theory behind the slaying is that it was a battle for succession in the Gambino family. Officials say that one suspect in the case is 45-year-old John Gotti, who's now a likely replacement for Castellano. It's believed that Gotti and other younger members of the family believe that because of legal problems of his own, Castellano was not paying enough attention to the multi-million-dollar mafia money-making activities, such as payoffs from corrupt construction jobs. There is also belief that other members of the so-called commission, the leadership of the 5 New York mafia families, may have approved. The big unknown, and what most troubles law enforcement officials, is whether this mob shooting is the opening round in a gangland war that will be fought on the city's streets.
Where do you think the person who ordered this is eventually going to end up? He's going to end up the same place Paul Castellano ended up, on a street with bullets in him.
And officials say that Castellano's high position in the national mob structure may set off a chain reaction of mob turmoil across the nation. Rita Braver, CBS News, New York.
Over an empire of dirty money and power built on drugs, flesh peddling, violence, and intimidation. Rita Braver reports.
Big Paul Castellano, reputed godfather of the Gambino family and the man considered boss of all mob bosses in the country, was on his way to a Manhattan steakhouse. As he stepped from his black Lincoln, 3 men wearing fur hats and trench coats suddenly appeared, pulled guns, pumped 6 bullets into Castellano and 6 into his top capo, Thomas Bellotti, and then calmly walked away. Castellano was under indictment in the federal government's case against the leadership of New York's 5 mafia families, known as the Commission. He was also currently on trial and out on $2 million bail in a car theft and murder case.
Well, I don't think they have to prove guilt or innocence with him anymore. That case is over.
The main theory that law enforcement officials are working is that this was part of a power struggle within the Gambino family.
No decision has been made on whether Edwards will be retried. Federal agents and New York police kept a close watch as hundreds of mourners paid last respects to Paul Castellano last night. The reputed boss of New York crime families was gunned down on Monday. He's being buried privately today. Authorities are still looking for the motive behind his murder.
Quiet neighborhood of Brooklyn. One man was killed. He was 58-year-old Frank DeChico, described as a lieutenant to John Gotti and the reputed head of the Gambino organized crime family. Another man was critically injured. Police have no suspects. When Ferdinand Marcos...
Even in New York City, the name John Gotti was virtually unknown until December 16th last year. That night, Paul Castellano, the reputed head of the Gambino crime family, was gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse. FBI agents have since testified that they believe the man behind the killings and the man who has taken Castellano's place is John Gotti. Only 45 years old, Gotti has become quickly recognizable, if only for his custom-made suits and his frequent stops at the Stylorama hair salon.
He's got very good taste. He likes his hair extremely perfect. He's such a gentleman that, you know, you can't believe it.
But a federal indictment charges that from a base of operations called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, Gotti headed a crew of mobsters who engaged in racketeering, extortion, robbery, and murder.
I don't think there's a place in America where we can get a fair trial.
Gotti's attorneys say the case has been prejudiced by stories which even in Gotti's own neighborhood have become local legend.
In 1980, Gotti's 12-year-old son was killed when he ran out in front of a neighbor's car. Within weeks, the neighbor disappeared. He has never been found, and detectives say they don't expect to solve the case.
Earlier this year, Romuald Pisek, a refrigeration mechanic, accused Gotti and an associate of beating and robbing him in a dispute over a double-parked car. But when the case went to court, Pisek suddenly decided not to testify.
If I did go stand there and say that this is Mr. Gotti and this is Mr. Coletta, they assaulted me and robbed me, I'm not sure.
Gotti's bail has since been revoked. The judge feared he might harass jurors, whose names will also be kept secret. Last week, the government revealed it had taped conversations between Gotti and a mafia informer. Gotti's lawyers called it idle conversation, but investigators believe the tapes will make the man they call the new Godfather past history. Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.
Have a seat, please. Mr. Martin.
Mr. Foreman, has the jury agreed upon a verdict as to each defendant?
Yes, we have.
Please rise. As to the defendant John Gotti. As to the defendant John Gotti, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty of the first count of the indictment, charging him with the crime of conspiracy in the 4th degree?
We find him not guilty.
With respect to the charge of conspiracy in the 5th degree, how say you with respect to the defendant John Gotti, guilty or not guilty?
We find him not guilty.
If you folks say anything else, you will not leave the building for the next 30 days. And if you think I'm kidding, I invite you to try it. If you folks can be calm, we will continue with this. If you can't be, we'll interrupt the proceedings. Please continue.
As to the second count of the indictment, charging the defendant John Gotti with the crime of assault in the 1st degree, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
We find the defendant not guilty.
A stunning defeat for the government's battle against organized crime in a New York courtroom today. John Gotti, the reputed New York mafia boss, went free. A jury acquitted him and 6 others for alleged criminal activities as part of the Gambino family, the largest so-called mafia family in the country. CBS News reporter Anthony Mason has been covering the trial.
In a 6-month trial, the government threw everything from wiretaps to surveillance tape at John Gotti, but they couldn't make their case stick. The man they say is the boss of the nation's most powerful mafia family was today found not guilty of racketeering and conspiracy.
They reviewed it and they came to the final truth. Justice. John Gotti and 6 other co-defendants were not guilty. They should never have been brought to this courtroom to begin with in the first place.
Investigators believe Gotti came to power when his predecessor, Paul Castellano, was murdered in December 1985. Surveillance cameras have been watching him for years, and mobsters turned informant testified he was a hoodlum's hoodlum. When the verdict was read today, gasps were heard in the courtroom. Gotti smiled, then glared over at the prosecutors and shouted, "Shame on them."
The jury's job was to decide whether or not the defendants were guilty. They did their job, and that is the end of that.
The Gotti verdict ends a string of government victories which had put many of the nation's top mafia bosses behind bars. Tony Dux Corallo, Carmine Jr. Persico, and Fat Tony Salerno were each sentenced to 100 years in prison in January. FBI agents believe Gotti planned Paul Castellano's murder, and prosecutors are expected to try to make another case against him.
The jury has spoken. We'll move on to the next case. Mr. Maloney, equal vigor.
But Gotti, imprisoned during the trial, is tonight a free man, thanks to a jury whose names were never revealed for their own protection. Said one defense lawyer, the government's case was a magic show, and today it went up in smoke. Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.
An alleged mafia leader is a free man this morning. On Friday, a federal judge found alleged mafia chief John Gotti innocent of racketeering and conspiracy charges, and he walked out a free man. The government is still watching him, though, and he knows it, which may make the taste of victory a bit sour. Barbara Nevins of WCBS TV reports.
As the first reputed mob boss to beat a major federal racketeering indictment, John Gotti now has to contend with the notoriety of acquittal. For Gotti and his family, it has been a weekend of catered platters and quiet celebration.
Very good, very happy.
Neighbors are treating Gotti like a much-maligned government hostage. They are tying yellow ribbons on trees outside of his home and the social club from which he is said to run the nation's most powerful crime family. If there is a sense of victory in Gotti's world, it is bittersweet. John Gotti and his family are aware that the feds are still after him.
Do you think the feds are going to try to nail your brother again?
Without a doubt.
Prosecutors have made it plain. John Gotti remains a target.
This office intends to prosecute every organized crime target that we have evidence on.
Last June, the entire hierarchy of the Gambino crime family, minus Gotti, was indicted on federal racketeering charges. This April, Gotti could find himself in the courtroom with the others. In addition, FBI agents say Gotti ordered the 1985 killing of his boss, Paul Castellano, and prosecutors trying to build a case are combining evidence from the murder with information from tapes secretly recorded in Gotti's social club. In the meantime, the FBI says John Gotti is a power to be reckoned with. In New York, Barbara Nevins for CBS News.
While the Teamsters were taken to court today, authorities also moved in on organized crime in another way. CBS News law correspondent Rita Braver reports.
The FBI and New Jersey State Police today arrested 22 alleged members and associates of the Genovese mob family, considered one of the country's most powerful mafia groups. The government says the case shows a unified and dangerous crime organization.
Also illustrates the connection between organized crime's violent activities, including murder, and some of its more seemingly innocuous activities such as sports and horse gambling.
In particular, the Justice Department charges that some members of the Genovese family gunned down Irwin Schiff last summer in a New York restaurant, barely missing other diners. The mysterious 350-pound Schiff was said to be a con man linked to the rival Gambino family. And the indictment also charges some of the Genovese family members with conspiracy to kill the reputed head of the Gambinos, John Gotti. The murder never occurred. Those arrested today were herded into a local armory under tight security and in an unusual move arraigned there. The Justice Department says today's charges continue the government strategy of going after the mafia family by family. Similar cases have been brought all through the Northeast, as well as in other cities across the nation. Those arrested today are allegedly part of the New Jersey branch of the Genovese crime syndicate.
What we're saying is we've taken that group down, and what occurs hereafter will determine whether or not it's been crippled or not.
In fact, the Justice Department is applying that logic not only to this case, but also to the alleged mafia infiltration of the Teamsters. Justice Department officials say the only way to control the mob is to keep pounding away at it day after day. Rita Braver, CBS News, Washington.
And while prosecutors were announcing the Teamsters action in New York, across the river in New Jersey, 22 members of the Genovese crime family were being indicted. They face federal charges that include labor payoffs, loan sharking, and running gambling operations. 3 are charged with murder, and several are accused of plotting to rub out rival gang leaders. The former head
Soul singer
of
James
CIA
Brown says if he could do it over, he just wouldn't do it. He made the statement to a judge yesterday during a court appearance in Georgia. Brown pleaded guilty to leading police on a 2-state car chase. He's already serving 6 years in a South Carolina prison for the same offense. The Georgia judge gave him another 6 years to run concurrently. Now some people making news this morning. John Gotti, who's said to be the most powerful organized crime boss in the country, is in a New York City jail this morning. Gotti was refused bail after he was arrested on charges of trying to have a construction union leader killed. And Jessica Hahn has reportedly told the New York State investigator that she had an expensive drug habit at the time she was collecting thousands of dollars in hush money from Jim Baker and his PTL ministry. After receiving $12,000, Hahn reportedly spent $7,000 of it on cocaine.
Critics, however, is whether a recent Justice Department reorganization will lessen the government's ability to go after other mafia godfathers. Richard Schlesinger has our report on that.
When John Gotti walks into court for his 3rd trial in less than 5 years, the smile on his face is a slap in the face to prosecutors. The government says the man who gives money to the homeless is the most powerful crime boss in America.
He's going to give you some money, Pete. All right, Pete, get some money.
The head of the Gambino crime family, a real-life godfather. But despite 2 attempts, they have been unable to convince a jury.
Right now, the state is trying to end the myth, to end the mystique, as it were, that Gotti is invincible.
Gotti is accused of ordering...
Spell the last name.
First defendant is G-O-T-T-I, first name John. Second defendant is G-U-E-R-R-I-E-R-I, first name Anthony. Item number 358 of 1989.
Charge. Arraign him, please. Wait for the other defendant. Good afternoon.
Bruce Cutler, CUTLER from Mr. Gotti.
John L. Pollock and Charles Weintraub, Hoffman Pollock, and Anthony Guerrero.
For the people assistant to Dr. Michael Cherkasky. This time, they would like to serve indictment 358 of 89, covered with indictments for
Arraign the defendants, please.
John Gotti and Anthony Guerrero. The grand jury of the county of New York has held indictment number 358 of 1989, charging each of you with the crimes of conspiracy in the 4th degree and assault in the 1st degree on 2 counts. John Gotti, how do you plead to these charges? Guilty or not guilty? Anthony Guerrero, how do you plead to these charges? Guilty or not guilty? Please not guilty. Your Honor, the people will serve intercept notice within the next 15 days. We will be providing copies of the intercept orders and reports. We will reserve statement notice. Within that 15 days, we will reserve a copy of the statements. Defendant Gotti's principles, character, reputation, and habits are certainly one of the fact that he is alleged to be, and we have evidence of in the form of wiretap information, the head of an organized criminal organization called the Gambino crime family. He is someone who has consistently put his and the interests of his associates and family above that of society. We think that that factor strongly mitigates to holding this defendant in. His employment and financial resources, his employment is allegedly as a salesman for a particular plumbing concern. This gentleman has been subject of extensive surveillance, and during that surveillance we have yet to see him at his employment in any way, shape, or form. That is his quote-unquote legitimate employment. His financial resources are literally that of the family, which is an extensive criminal organization throughout the United States and throughout the world. I don't mean to overstate it, but it is very difficult to get a handle on what his financial resources are and inform your honor of that to ensure his return. So that we would just have to say at this point that the financial resources are enormous. We could also comment that during the period of intercepts, Mr. Gotti has gambled numerous occasions and has lost enormous sums of money, counting in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that we know that he has idle money available for him. Third is family ties, the length of time in the residence. Mr. Gotti has been a resident of this community for his whole life, to our knowledge. He has a family, wife and children. But at the same time, the people would like to point out to the court that in 1973, this defendant was, May of 1973, participated in a homicide. That homicide led to an indictment with Mr. Gotti and Mr. Angelo Ruggiero. Mr. Ruggiero was apprehended. There were substantial efforts made to apprehend Mr. Gotti, but Mr. Gotti chose to absent himself from his home, so that for a period of approximately a year, he was not at home. And we think that goes to show that whatever ties they are, he still has a predilection to put his interests ahead of his close ties.
Yes, may it please the court. Your Honor, by way of background, I've represented John Gotti since 1985. I don't know if the court is aware, but in 1987 he was acquitted in Brooklyn Federal Court of this so-called Gambino Association. In addition to which, Your Honor, John Gotti is basically followed night and day, every day by the police. And they've never seen him commit a crime, and they've never seen him do anything wrong. I was a little surprised last night, Judge, when they picked him up at around 5 o'clock on Broadway with about 50 or 70 agents and policemen, because had they called me up, Your Honor, rather than go to Judge Williams last night, I could have seen you this morning with John. I tried 3 cases with him. I tried 1 in front of Judge Dufficy. I tried 2 in front of Judge Nickerson. He gets to court before the building opens. And the only issue here is whether he's going to show up. He has always shown up in every case he's ever had. He's always on time. As a matter of fact, Your Honor, most poignantly, in the federal court in Brooklyn, the United States attorneys both said that John Gotti is not a flight risk. Policemen have testified that John Gotti is not a flight risk. He has never, ever missed a court date. Judge, he hasn't been convicted of a crime for over 15 years. He was convicted, he pled guilty in 75, he went to jail, he came out. Since 77, they've been watching him every day, night and day. As I said to you, we went to trial in Queens once, and then we went to trial in Brooklyn. As far as his family, Your Honor, you know he's been married well over 25 years. He has 4 children, 4 grandchildren. He's not going anyplace. He's been in New York his whole life. He's never ran away from a problem ever. We are both confident, Your Honor, even though we got the indictment today, we got an indicia of it last night, we'll win this case. I'm not concerned about the case. I'm concerned about the DA making a bail application for a remand. And I'm concerned about the fact that they chose to lock him up at night rather than call me up. Because, you know, Judge, if you want to know where John Gotti is...
Mr. Cutler, I was concerned also when they asked for the warrant.
I'm sorry?
I was concerned also.
Yes, sir. Because if you want to know where he is, I know where he is, and the police know where he is. Because they follow him day and night. So there's no problem with flight, Your Honor. I was asking you, not in any way disingenuous, Judge, to release him. Because had they not arrested him last night, we would have been here together at 9 o'clock in the morning. I think the case is weak. There's not the slightest indicia of evidence that John will ever flee.
You're expressing your opinion that it's weak.
Yes, sir.
The district attorney says in his opinion it is strong. Thank you.
I want you to know, and also, Your Honor, one other thing. Last night, after we went through the speech, Judge Williams felt constrained to keep him overnight. But I felt in my heart she wanted to let him go. She had no power.
She wanted to let, she had the power. She had the power, sir. I'll hear you.
Your Honor, excuse me, if I could...
I'll let you respond after both applications are done.
I don't know that there's been an application yet on behalf of Mr.
Are you making an application?
Certainly am. Would you like me to make it first, sir?
Yes.
Your Honor, the people are asking for a remand as to Mr. Guerrieri. As appears from his sheet and our records, he's not eligible for any additional punishment as Mr. Gotti would be considered persistent, but he is eligible for from 5 to 15 years on this more ties that Mr. Gotti has admitted. We think that Mr. Guerrieri has used a number of different names where he's living, where he currently resides. He's using a second name, that of Anthony Albano. The apartment's registered.
Mr. Gotti, the court is setting bail in the amount of $100,000 bond or cash. With respect to Mr. Guerrieri, bail is set in the amount of $50,000 bond or cash.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hold it. This case is assigned to Judge Atlas, Part 39. The matter is being sent to Judge Atlas because he has a related matter.
Yes, sir. Do we need a date from you?
Yes. A Monday, please. Yeah. Put it on for next Monday, the 30th.
Your Honor, we just a further application.
Yes, hold it a minute, please. Take seats. The matter is on for January 30th, Part 39, Judge Atlas's Part 111 Center Street. Yes, what is your application?
People ask that there be a condition of bail that the defendants do not travel outside the United States. If there are going to be any...
Do you have a passport, Mr. Gotti?
No, Your Honor.
Do you have a passport, sir? They leave. Without a passport, I don't know where they can go.
The people will also ask that we be notified if the defendants intend to travel outside the state.
I'll restrict them to the continental limits of the United States. If they are going to be leaving the state of New York, however, I would advise, I'm ordering that you advise your attorney, and your attorney is to advise the district attorney.
Yes, sir, we'll do that.
Well, may we approach a related matter?
Sure.
Defendant is in the hospital, Judge.
So you need a hospital room?
Right.
Well,
do you want to do that, or you want Atlas to do that?
When is he getting out? Atlas for years?
He may not.
What?
He may not.
He's dying?
Yeah, he's lung cancer.
Head down, head down. Hey, you're gonna hurt yourself. Come on. Hey, John, you gonna beat it this time? Got a boy, Hey, John, you gonna beat it? Nothing at all. How do you think about the way you were picked up last night? You think that was planned down on purpose? What do you think? Behind you. Any message to Morgenthau with this? You think you're gonna get done? Sorry. Go, Josh. John, you think you'll beat it? Bruce here. Did he say anything? Did he say anything?
In New York City this morning, the man police call the country's most powerful crime boss faces the possibility of life in prison for allegedly ordering the shooting of a union official. Barbara Nevins of WCBS TV reports.
John Gotti looked pale after a night in a Rikers Island cell. Smartly dressed in a sport coat and turtleneck, he didn't hesitate to respond to charges of assault and conspiracy.
John Gotti, how do you plead to these charges? Guilty or not guilty?
Police arrested Gotti in Little Italy as he left the Ravenite Social Club. Hundreds of hours of secret recordings made in Gotti's Ozone Park headquarters reveal investigators say that he and two others ordered the 1986 shooting of Carpenters Union business agent John O'Connor. Gotti on the tapes was overheard to say O'Connor must be bust or busted up. Ronald Goldstock, chief of the State Organized Crime Task Force, had the club bugged.
John Gotti, alleged in the indictment to be the boss of the Gambino family, is now under indictment, ironically, for an act, it's alleged, that was designed to consolidate his power as the head of a family racked by assassination and dissension.
The reason for the shooting was straightforward. O'Connor allegedly ordered his boys to smash up the construction site of what is now Bankers and Brokers Restaurant in Battery Park City. The restaurant, owned by a reputed Gambino associate, wasn't using union labor. The vandalism was retribution. But John Gotti, as the new boss of the Gambino crime family, had to have the last say, according to prosecutors. And members of the Westies crime gang were allegedly hired as the shooters. O'Connor is under indictment for ordering the damage. Prosecutors are aware of Gotti's celebrity, his folk hero status.
His financial resources are literally that of the family, which is an extensive criminal organization throughout the United States and throughout the world.
As prosecutors asked for Gotti to be held without bail, Gotti stood silently. His attorney said Gotti won't run.
He's not going anyplace. He's been in New York his whole life. He's never ran away from a problem, ever.
Gotti was released on $100,000 bail. I'm Barbara Nevins for CBS News, New York.
I don't want to move.
Gotti took charge of what's called the Gambino crime family shortly after his reputed predecessor was gunned down. The government also said Gotti ordered an assault on a union official, and it took him to court to prove that charge. A jury brought in its verdict today on the man called the Dapper Don. Harold Dow has our report.
How say you with respect to defendant John Gotti, guilty or not guilty?
We find him not guilty.
He was found not guilty on all counts of conspiracy and assault. For weeks, prosecutors portrayed him as the Godfather, the man who ordered the failed hit on New York union boss John O'Connor. The government claimed tapes secretly recorded at Gotti's headquarters proved it. In the end, the jurors said the government didn't prove its case.
There was nothing to connect up Mr. Gotti from what happened. Zilch. I'm not saying he didn't do it. I simply had my doubts.
The government thinks you just say mafia and you sit down on your backside and that's enough. It's not enough in America to say mafia and sit down.
3 times the government tried to convict Gotti in the past 5 years. 3 times it failed. So this afternoon, to a cheering crowd, John Gotti walked away a free man. Free, he says, to continue his work as a salesman for a plumbing company. Free, the government says, to continue his reign as the godfather of the largest crime family in America. Harold Dow, CBS News, New York.
The reputed head of the nation's most powerful mafia family is behind bars this morning. John Gotti was arrested by FBI agents in New York last night. The New York Times reports that Gotti will be charged with ordering the murder of Paul Castellano, the man he allegedly succeeded in 1986. Gotti is called the Teflon Don because of the government's repeated failures to win a case against him.
Jury selection began here in New York today for the trial of the man reputed to be the nation's #1 mobster. As Giselle Fernandez reports, it's the government's latest attempt to get a guilty verdict against John Gotti and make it stick.
It was February 1990. New York's Little Italy shot up the sky. John Gotti faced down the government and beat the rap again.
We're all happy. We're all happy. We got a good decision. The whole city should be happy.
Gotti's acquittal, his third court victory in 4 years, fueled his legendary status as Teflon Don. To some, he's a modern-day Al Capone.
The reason why he's a folk hero is because he beat the first case. He is handsome. He does wear $2,000 suits. He is well-groomed. Every hair is always in place. He's quick with one-liners.
It's Gotti's air of invincibility that's even served him well in the courtroom. Despite charges he rigged past trials, jurors seemed more charmed by him than frightened.
You see him there in courtroom. He's well-dressed. He's clean-shaven. He looks good. I mean, they tell you about all the things he's doing. He doesn't look like a thug. He doesn't look like a criminal.
But now those who observe the mob say Gotti's winning streak is about to screech to a halt. For the government, this is a must-win case. They've said it before, but this time the feds say they've really got the goods to lock the reputed godfather away for life.
You tell this punk, me, John Gotti, tonight, to sever your head off. You're old enough for it.
These surveillance tapes, say prosecutors, will prove Gotti is a ruthless crime boss of the Gambino family, responsible for the murder of, among others, his predecessor, Paul Castellano, shot dead outside a New York steakhouse. Prosecutors have another lethal weapon. Gotti's hand-picked underboss cut a deal and will testify for the government.
The decision by Sammy Gravano to testify is certainly a big event. He's been there since John Gotti came to power. He knows where all the bodies are buried.
Gotti's associates had little to say about the trial. Outside their clubhouse door hangs a yellow ribbon of hope for their boss's return. But with him or without him, family business goes on as usual. Giselle Fernandez, CBS News, New York.
A jury here in New York City heard more graphic testimony today as federal prosecutors try again to nail the man alleged to be America's top mobster. Their star witness, his former aide, a confessed hitman who says he killed at least 19 people. Jacqueline Adams is covering the mob trial.
You've seen it in the movies, but this is real life. In a Brooklyn courtroom, Sammy the Bull Gravano is violating the blood oath he took when he joined the mob, testifying against his boss, the so-called Teflon Don or Dapper Don, John Gotti. Once Gotti's right-hand man, Gravano is the highest-ranking member of the Gambino crime family to testify for the government. Today, in Gotti's murder and racketeering trial, Gravano explained how the two men plotted the 1985 murder of then-boss Paul Castellano and his driver, Tommy Bellotti, how they watched the hit go down outside a New York City steakhouse and then drove past the bullet-riddled bodies. Gravano testified, "I believe Paul got shot first. Tommy squatted down to look through the window and somebody came up behind him and shot." After 3 failed attempts, prosecutors hope Gravano will finally help them strip the Teflon from the Don.
He's been there since John Gotti came to power. He knows where all the bodies are buried.
Indeed, on secret FBI recordings, Gotti can be heard anointing Gravano as his successor, should he go to prison or the can.
This is my wishes. That when I'm with a head, this family's gonna be one place saving.
Still, the lawyer who won Gotti's earlier acquittals believes Gravano's testimony can be shaken.
They are paid government witnesses, and from time to time we have proved that they will say what the government wants them to say.
If convicted, Gotti faces life in prison. To ensure a lighter sentence, Gravano decided to sing. Jacqueline Adams, CBS News, Brooklyn.
The government says John Gotti is a cold-blooded killer, perhaps the most ruthless and powerful mob boss in America. Then why is the guy so popular?
He's bigger than life, bigger than I thought he would be.
Gotti's legend has grown so big, he's called the Teflon Don. 3 previous times the government went after him, and 3 times the charges didn't stick. Not since Prohibition and the flamboyant Al Capone has a reputed mob boss ignited the collective imagination of the American public.
He is handsome. He does wear $2,000 suits. He is well-groomed. Every hair is always in place. He's quick with one-liners.
Gotti has been a cover boy. He's probably the first mob cover boy.
The supermodel of mobsters, Gotti on magazine covers, newspaper headlines. One New York tabloid even followed his court suits, the cut, not the criminal, in a daily fashion column called Gotti's Garb. And every day at the courthouse, the dapper Don plays to a sellout crowd. In New York, the Gotti trial is the hottest show off Broadway, with spectators lining up as early as 2 in the morning, waiting hours for a chance to get inside the courtroom.
I'm interested in the case because Gotti's kind of cool. I read about it and I can't even believe what's going on. I wanted to see it for myself.
We love villains. We don't admit we love villains, but we do like very much the character who goes against the organization or the character that goes against the law. He represents what the average guy doesn't have the nerve to try to do.
It's not just average guys caught up in the Gotti spectacle. A who's who from Hollywood came to Brooklyn to take in the show.
This is one of the great dramas that's going on today.
Art is imitating life on the silver screen. A movie about another flashy gangster, Bugsy Siegel, is one of this year's most critically acclaimed.
The name is Ben. Benjamin is in the Bible.
Hollywood has long been married to the mob, for years glamorizing the grit on film. But recently, the box office has racked up a string of mob hits. But the real-life good fella, Henry Hill, doesn't understand the public's fascination with guys who are anything but good.
The mob is about greed. The mob is about brutality. The mob is about terror.
We've been going to the Coliseum since time immemorial, haven't you? And, you know, been thumbs up and thumbs down, and we love conflict, and we love a big fight.
Step right up, folks. Read the story behind the headlines.
Mafia Mania is just what the publishers of a new book on Gotti are banking on. They sold out at the courthouse. Production of 2 TV movies is already underway. Whatever the legal outcome, it seems the legend of the Teflon Don is one the public can't refuse. Lisa Rudolph.
The Teflon Don was acquitted, but the trial exposed the crimes of the Gambino family. Next Tuesday's CBS movie Getting Gotti tells Diane Giacaloni's story, and she is here this morning with Lorraine Bracco, who plays her. Good morning.
Morning.
Talk to us a little bit. Take us back to the mid-'80s when you started to go after this guy. What was inside you that made you think you had to get him?
Well, when we started, we weren't actually going after Gotti. We were actually prosecuting a series of hijacking cases and armored car robberies. But over time, we found that he and his crew were controlling an awful lot of crime in New York City, all over New York City. And we decided to take it apart. We decided to take the entire crew apart, not just from the top, but all the way through the ranks.
All right, I want to take a look at a clip, and which is the other real irony in this, because you grew up in the same neighborhood.
I did. I grew up in Queens, out in Richmond Hill, Ozone Park, and saw the kinds of seductions that went on, the corruption of young people that went on.
And the social club, the so-called social club, is right next to...
It's close to a school I went to. It's next to the church that we went to.
Now, how is it for you, Lorraine, to play not only somebody real, but someone that you end up talking with on a regular basis about how real this story is? What difficulties did it present to you?
Oh, it wasn't difficult. It was really kind of nice to be able to have Diane and go back to her and say, well, what happened then and what happened here and things like that.
Yeah. Different, though, certainly different than, had you ever had an experience like this before?
Well, no, because, you know, I made another kind of, I guess, what we would call mob movie, Goodfellas.
Right.
And, it was the other side of the coin, and I, you know, couldn't really find anybody to talk to about what it would be to be a mafia's, you know, wife.
Yeah.
So Diane was a nice breath of fresh air for that for me.
Interesting, looking at that scene from in the little diner there, the notion that, because you look at a Goodfellas, which in some ways depicts a dark underside of what that life was like, but the Teflon Don, this guy would come on the news in his spectacular suits and with Bruce Cutler, and he almost became like a folk hero.
He became a folk hero, but he was a folk hero who never spoke. If you look through the clips, you never heard him speak, and one of the reasons is that there's so much violence in his voice. It's very hard to disguise voices, and the violence of his life is epitomized in the violence of his voice, and that's what was disguised. The media didn't catch that.
Is there anything, when you're making a movie like this, is there any part of you that feels like you're on even like a little bit of a mini crusade? to tell the right side of the story, to help get out the truth.
Of course. And that was something that, besides when I had gotten the script, you know, Diane jumped at me. It wasn't so much the fact that it was John Gotti and the whole mob thing, because I'd already kind of done that. But what had interested me was Diane and Diane's plight, and who was this girl who came from that neighborhood that had to do the right thing for herself. And I was very, very interested in this. And I always know I'm interested in a script when I can't sleep and I keep thinking about it, or it wakes me up and I go, my God, this really happened to this girl. What happened? Who? How? When? So
we'll find out all of that next week, next Tuesday night, when the movie is on television. Congratulations to you both. Thanks for coming in this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lauren.
Good job. 5 before the
stylish clothes. John Gotti was sentenced 10 years ago to life in prison for racketeering and murder. And a life sentence it proved to be. He died Monday of throat cancer in a prison hospital at the age of 61. The Catholic Church refused a funeral mass for John Gotti, but that was just about the only honor the deceased Don was denied. His wake was big news, as was yesterday's private funeral service and the motorcade to his final resting place. Many humble people who lived quiet and productive and law-abiding lives died this past week across America. Not one of them received as much attention or as many flowers as John Gotti.